After the Second Battle of Trippi, everybody needed to lick their wounds, especially humanity. The Pachu had sent in exactly what they were willing to lose. It seemed as though their own personality, their own culture, was an all or nothing culture. There was never any backup, it seemed like. It was not something that the humans understood. How could somebody simply throw their own people into a meat grinder and not care? Oh, there'll always be more. That is, until humanity was once reminded by Rejren himself how certain governments around the world before the meet and greet of great hospitality, where Rejren and the rest of the Toes met up with humanity. Before then, many of the cultures, many of the countries around the world simply threw their young men into the line of fire, watching them drop in waves after waves, as if somebody was just standing there with a giant sickle, just taking them down as though they were nothing more than wheat. When they heard this, everybody in the council room simply paused, thought for a moment. There was a few glances, of course, many of them looking in certain directions, yet everybody understood that this is how it is. And every single one of those militaries, unless they have support from somewhere else, always fail. And if it's simply a culture that believes in wasting their own people, they too fail, and they fail miserably. Why? They never actually think of using hospitality, of bringing in any type of support, which means they're on their own. They're bullies. They think they can face anybody on their own. But guess what happens when somebody fights back against the bully? The bully gets embarrassed. The bully gets bitch slapped. Humanity continued to build up its forces along with the Toes. The Toes were not as efficient at creating vessels, and they also needed more raw materials because, well, they're much larger than humans are. In fact, it's noted that many of the humans actually enjoyed being on the Toes ships because the rooms and the halls were just so massive. Even when the power was out, you didn't have to worry about smacking into somebody really hard. It was just comfortable. However, the Toes always like to be on human ships as well. Not only did they always have hydroponics bays that always had fresh food, but it seems as though humans were obsessed with comfort. Even on the smallest of ships, the Corvette personal transports, there was always something, some sort of hollow gaming system, some sort of three-dimensional, something to do, something fun. Not to mention, whenever they were on any type of sleeping structure that humans called a bed, the Toes, even though they couldn't stretch out, couldn't believe how soft they were. As hard as the ships are, how undecorative they are, how standard they all seem to be, it seems as though humanity always had comfort. At any given time, a Toes would enjoy this comfort because you never know when it's going to end, especially in a war zone. Even on the large battleships, the dreadnoughts, and everything else, there was always something there just to keep up morale, to bring a little bit of comfort, and many of the Toes simply docked their ships against the humans, locked on, and enjoyed these amenities. Of course, they also began to talk strategy. Something the Toes were not expecting was the high amount of simulators that were inside these ships. In fact, aboard many of the dreadnoughts, there was entire decks with three-dimensional holograms set up specifically to show how to face off against the enemy. Many times they would face off against each other, and the Toes were simply astounded. This is why humans were so good. They tested their own battles against each other, they tested their own equipment, seeing what worked, what didn't. There was a standard as far as the equipment goes, but it seemed like every single human had modified just a little bit, just enough. Maybe their sidearm was a little lower on their leg. Maybe they carried more ammo. Maybe they had an extra medical pouch. It didn't matter. Every single one was just slightly different. And this made many of the Toes think, so this is why the Paw Chew cannot beat them. It was a strange phrase, considering that the Paw Chew had actually put severe damage on the human fleet. If they had realized that the high amount of damage and they had sent another fleet through the rift, they might have actually taken down the humans, as everybody was simply scrambling to get ammunition, scrambling to fix the overheating that was happening on all the ships, and of course, fixing the hull of the ships. Many of the ships that were there now held battle scars. As humans said, it builds character. But they knew exactly what that meant, and many of the tows that saw a ship that one of its sides was blown open and fresh plating had been welded on, they looked at it and thought, wow, and they're just going to keep fighting. It astounded them, it surprised them, but they began to fully understand human tenacity as they started to bring the lessons down to their own. They would mainly stick to the space warfare, as they really didn't have enough personnel to go down to the surface of a planet. Not to mention the size difference meant if they went into a Pachu area, they would be basically crawling trying to fight. And that would leave them at an extreme disadvantage. So they decided to focus on the naval warfare. They wanted to see what the human navy would do. And every time they were in a simulation against the human navy, they saw patterns, but everyone was different. They saw the standard pattern, but it was always based around the weapon systems themselves, always firing the long range weapons and then torpedoes and missiles and using those almost as a shield, as a decoy for the drones themselves, and the drones doing much of the work. Even though many of the large weapons, if they do strike, they are devastating. But the problem is, they need to strike. At ranges being fought, sometimes it took far too long for a shot to reach, which gave enough time for even a battleship to dodge, duck, or shimmy out of the way. A strange dance in space, which is why the clusters of ships were never always that close. In one particular simulation, Ren thought that he would condense his forces as tight as he could and fire directly towards the human battleship. But in the simulation, the human battleship simply aimed at his, and when he went to move out of the way, they continued to fire, and he couldn't move without striking one of his own. In the simulation, they saw that the ships tore themselves to pieces trying to move out of each other's way, missing their shots, allowing humans to get even closer, and that's all she wrote. Sometimes, when one of the tows would come in and attempt to actually win one of these simulations, they would hear a strange word, a strange phrase from the humans called Koshe Mari Meru or something along those lines. They couldn't figure out what it was, but eventually they just buckled down and asked. And they were told that that is considered an unwinnable scenario. With that, the tows looked and asked, "Do you really think you are unbeatable?" With that, most of the humans would look and say, "No, but close enough." This, of course, got everyone to laugh and actually allowed folks to relax just a little bit, as there was an active war zone. Around the drift, ships still aimed directly at it. If any of the Pachu were going to come in, they were definitely going to come in through the rift. And now more battleships were there. Many of them pulled back a little bit more just so they could bring their larger weapons to bear long before their point defense systems have to kick in. And now everything's set up in a way that if any of the Pachu come through, they're going to be ripped in half, or many other smaller pieces, before they even have a chance to bring their weapons to bear. With that secured, humanity moved on to their other plan. They had promised the Pachu that they would get a fair shake. They told them about the white flag and how it would allow them to talk, to bring everyone to terms so that the battles can stop and everyone can just stop dying. But the Pachu just did not seem to care at all. It seemed all they cared about was their own supremacy over others, and they're about to find out what happens when you decide to disrespect the white flag and stab a human in the back. Not only did they had stabbed humanity in the back, but they had killed almost everybody aboard a battleship using sabotage by under a promise that they would talk. No, they didn't want to talk. They just wanted to kill. Well, they don't realize that when you're over towards the drift, it is kill or be killed. Rejren was in on the final briefing, and he was not happy with what was going to happen. He started bringing up all sorts of issues with the plan and how his own ships were not as fast as humanity ships. They wouldn't be able to get high enough in the FTL range to actually keep up to be part of the battle itself. He wanted to be there. And finally, after a lot of debate, everyone said, fine, we'll simply slow down. That just means we're going to have more power for the weapons and for the new shields that came up. The new shields being a bunch of disruptor shields, which seem to be about 95% effective against Paw Chew's shock weaponry. However, they're not very effective against the new energy beam weapons that the Paw Chew seem to be bringing. This meant on the next target, the Hemorrhoid, they need to be fast. They need to make sure they took down the target as quick as possible. And Rejren, even though he had seen the firepower of humanity, he didn't think that they would be able to take down this target all that fast. On the way to the target, Rejren was a little upset with the fact that he had to jump in with the humans. Every time they jumped in a way that hid their power surge with the local star. He did not like jumping that close to a star, as every single time, well, it felt like all of his intestines, his heart, and even his brain got yoinked to one side, all very, very fast. This was not something his crew enjoyed either, and many of them ended up vomiting onto the floor, although when he talked to the humans immediately afterwards, he looked in the background and seen at least two of the bridge crew had not only vomited, but one was rushing out the door with his hand very, very low on his torso. So low that it was right where his legs together. And he realized what had happened during the jump. It had been just as violent for the humans, and it seemed as though at least one of them, well, he needed a shower very, very badly. As they got close to the last jump, everyone got ready. All the joking around that the soldiers were doing and everything the sailors were doing in their off time that just raised all sorts of a ruckus seemed to die down and was very, very quiet. Rejren had taken a shuttle over to one of the battleships just to talk to the captain himself, and as he went through, the silence, it worried him. He asked the captain why everything is so quiet. Is everyone in cryo sleep? What's going on? The captain simply, no. They're just getting ready. Ready for what? Rejren asked. The battle coming up? You see, when humans get loud, the fight that's going to happen is really nothing. But when they get quiet, if you hear our guys, I guarantee you go into the drop base and you listen to those guys who do their CQB, if they're quiet, oh boy, I almost feel bad for the Paw Chew. Rejren looked over, and if his fur had not covered his skin, everyone would see that he went completely pale underneath. He realized the implication of this. Yet he realized that all those in the pod bays would be a little pissed off that they might not have a chance to actually show exactly what they can do. The final jump came in. As they went into the Hemorrhoid station, they ended up right outside, only a few million kilometers away, just to the point where they could see a tiny, tiny little dot, which was about the size of a moon. That was the Hemorrhoid station. That was one of the most dangerous stations out there because it was designed specifically to build Paw Chew ships. It's believed that taking out their logistics would mean that they would come to the negotiating table, and hopefully this time they would leave their explosives at home. However, since the Paw Chew liked to blow things up so bad, they were in for one hell of a shock. The human fleet went as fast as they can towards the Hemorrhoid station. The Hemorrhoid station, of course, went immediately on alert as there was no way to not see the humans coming in. A fleet that large and ships that big, even if you tried to hide them with a star, would easily be picked up on their sensors. They got in at least halfway, and that's when Rejren, well, his heart sank to his ass. He saw all sorts of ships surrounding the station. They were there to protect it. Also, he saw hundreds and thousands of ships coming out of the stations themselves. There was openings on all of them. It seemed as though somebody had just pissed on a beehive and everything was coming out. And as he watched, he got a message from the humans that simply said, "Watch this." He watched over, and the silence of space was emphasized by the silence of his own crew. They zoomed in and they watched the station as one of the dreadnoughts opened up slightly, and there was a pulse, a strange pulse that came out. Another one, and another one, and another one, as though it's building up, and all of a sudden there was an energy burst from it, but he couldn't see anything that was going out. Then they changed the electromagnetic spectrum and they saw what was happening. There was a direct energy weapon being launched directly at the Hemorrhoid station. It went into the station. They looked in close and nothing happened. He wondered if the humans had messed up. And then he heard, "Wait for it." 4.8 seconds later, the entire space station that was 1.8 the size of the human's moon Luna exploded. The direct energy weapons had destabilized everything down to the quantum level. The entire station itself was now a bomb that exploded omnidirectional, taking out every single one of the Pachu ships anywhere close by. Even the next celestial body over could see the explosion, which turned into a mini star for just a moment. And Rejren couldn't believe what he was seeing. Humans could take out a planet? But I know this was a synthetic construct, but they could take one out. They didn't even fire their main weapon systems. What is this? With that, he looked over to the dreadnought, which seemed to be trying to get rid of all the excess heat before it slowly closed the tiny little gap that it had created. Rejren looked over to his crew, all of which had their eyes open, none blinking. They all just stared ahead, all of them with their mouths wide open, some of them dropping items from their hands and not even caring what's going on. They couldn't believe that they had just won a major battle. They had done nothing. They had just shown up. The humans could have done this with one ship, perhaps. And they definitely could have taken care of this one target without any of the toes there at all. When they asked later, why? Why did you insist on having us if you could take out this target yourself? In fact, you could use that one ship and you could have won the battle. With that, every single human looked over at Rejren as he had another third antler coming out of his nose. They were confused at the question, but then one of them answered, "Oh, that's simple. Just like a sniper or anyone else, you don't fight a war alone. You don't go out alone. That's a quick way of ending up getting blasted. You can't watch your back all the times if you're focused on one target. That's why you never, ever go alone." Rejren understood this, sat back on his chair, and just absorbed all the information. He thought, what about the next target? You took out the Hemorrhoid station with hardly any issue. Could you do the same thing to an entire planet? He looked around to the entire room and not a single human answered. They simply looked at him, looked at each other, and then, all right, so our next target is going to be... Hello, everybody. This is Syntax. Thank you for joining me today on part 9 of this ongoing series. Now, before I go, I need to say that today's winner is Steve Ewing, with Douglas Scarborough coming in a very close second. I also need to send out some great big thank yous to the supporters of this channel, and they are Prozac and Pancakes, Steve Ewing, Erica Gem, SS Demon, Guardian Sage, MTF Guard, Brian Kemp, Douglas Scarborough, Joseph Blosh, and Julius Boone. Thank you all so much for supporting the channel. Everybody else, I'll see you on the next one. This is Syntext.
Ejecting pilot.